So today we're going to talk about children's literature and the role it plays in society. Throughout history, adults have used the power of stories to entertain and amuse their children. But stories are not used merely to entertain youngsters. They have a significant educational purpose. They serve to teach the moral values of their society. In sociological terms, stories are one of the means by which children are socialized. How does this work in practice? Well, it often makes use of heroes, the characters in the stories who the children will admire and want to be like. The heroes of children's stories, therefore, exemplify the qualities valued by that society. They will typically demonstrate courage in the face of difficulty, honesty, consideration for others, loyalty to their family and friends, a respect for work, and so on. You can see this happening from the fables of ancient societies, through fairy tales and folk tales, right up to modern-day children's stories. For example, the hard-working ant in Aesop's fable is shown to succeed, in comparison with the grasshopper, who spends the summer singing and has nothing to eat when winter comes. Similarly, it is Cinderella, the honest, hard-working sister, who wins the prince, rather than her cruel, lazy stepsisters. However, there is still usually something to entertain children, even in the most morally instructive of stories.
Public lands in the U.S. are managed with two goals in mind: protecting biodiversity and providing people with recreational opportunities, a chance to connect with nature. But sometimes those two goals are at odds, especially if recreation, activities like hiking or hunting, disrupts wild animals enough to alter their use of those landscapes. Indeed, several years ago, a study done in California found that hikers had a negative impact on wildlife.
And that kind of sounded a bit of an alarm to us as wildlife biologists and as people who like to go hiking ourselves.
Wildlife biologist Roland Kays of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences at NC State University.
We were pretty worried that this problem was as bad as it seemed from that study and as widespread, and was widespread, that there could be a real conflict between outdoor recreation and wildlife conservation.
To find out, Kays and his team enlisted the help of more than 350 volunteer citizen scientists who deployed camera traps at nearly 2,000 sites within 32 protected areas in 6 different states. Roughly half of the areas allowed hunting and half did not. What they discovered was something of a relief.
We found relatively minor impacts of hunting and hiking on wildlife.
It's not that human activities didn't impact wildlife at all, of course. Heavily hunted species, like white-tailed deer, gray squirrels, and raccoons, were photographed somewhat less often in hunted areas. Coyotes showed up more often in hunted areas, and while most species didn't avoid hiking trails, the predators actually preferred them. But they did find something that had a much bigger impact on wildlife: habitat quality. The best predictor of wildlife abundance was not human activity, but factors like forest connectivity, nearby housing density, and the amount of adjacent agriculture. The results were published in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And they suggest that outdoor recreation, a $646 billion industry in the U.S., is currently managed in a sustainable way, but also that protecting the scattered patches of wild habitat that do remain in the U.S. is vital, both for wildlife and for people.
Recreation, including hunting and hiking, and wildlife conservation can coexist in the same place at the same time. And we can go out there and enjoy nature, enjoy the woods, hope to catch a glimpse of wildlife without worrying about hurting the populations in the process.
Women scientists at research universities still face barriers in hiring and promotion, and the U.S. is thus being deprived of an important source of scientific talent. Those are the findings in a report titled Beyond Bias and Barriers: Fulfilling the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering. The report was issued this week by the National Academy of Science and associated institutions. Yale biophysics and biochemistry professor Joan Steitz served on the committee that wrote the report.
It's not overt prejudice, but rather the accumulation of a lot of little things that add up to discourage women.
The report notes that women science faculty are paid less and promoted more slowly despite comparable productivity as men. It includes some 24 recommendations to try to address the situation.
I hope that it won't be like so many reports that have gone before it, where 10 years later, people look around and see that really nothing's happened.
Researchers from Children's Hospital in Boston were curious about the links between the flu and air travel. After all, one infected person can spread an outbreak from Miami to Seattle in hours. So the researchers looked at two different government statistics. They examined flu records between 1996 and 2005, and they also collected government estimates of the number of people traveling by airplane in those years. Well, in every year, the number of flu cases peaked between February 15th and 19th, except for 2001, when the peak date was March 2nd, almost 2 weeks later. Of course, in 2001, there was no air travel in the days after September 11th, and traffic was down even after flights resumed. So it looks like staying home helped keep the flu from spreading. The findings, published in the journal Public Library of Science Medicine, could inform decision-making in the event of a big flu epidemic. And what great revenge against the perpetrators of the September 11th attacks. We used data we wouldn't have had otherwise to control disease and save lives. Apes, for example, gorillas and chimpanzees, probably have the potential for being much smarter than their current environment requires them to be. Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting notion. So you think that, and you do see this, according to the article, when a great ape is adopted in a human family and
right.
is required to do more human things, clearly the potential for that intelligence was there.
Yeah. So the idea is, of course, that inputs, put it like this, you're not born intelligent. You're made intelligent because of inputs. There has to be something there, some infrastructure. But if you don't fill it, if you don't develop it, and as you know, the brain is extremely plastic, and that's also true for primate brains. So you need to have these inputs. Social inputs enhance the signal-to-noise ratio. But of course, it really depends on what those social inputs are. Great ape inputs are not human inputs. So you might call it the bootstrapping problem, in the sense that if you could somehow, and that's what we do experimentally, increase the efficiency of those inputs, show these animals things that they would not normally see in the wild, then of course it turns out that with that same equipment, if you prime it properly, so to speak, you can actually reach much higher levels of cognitive performance, and that's in the end, the expressed realized intelligence is in the end what natural selection sees. The fact that they still have these big brains in the wild and they do relatively, for us, not so intelligent things with it is simply because of the nature of the inputs. They can't make those inputs any better than they are. If you can, then you can achieve much greater intellectual performance with the same brain.
And of course, we are also talking about various species here who already have the potential for pretty high intelligence. You cannot teach a cat to interact the same way as you can teach a great ape to interact.
Absolutely. And the other thing that it actually shows you is that if you would compare, say, an orangutan or a chimpanzee in the wild with a human hunter-gatherer, you would see massive differences. And yet, you could, now that we do these kinds of experiments, you could see that the differences are actually not as big, because with a great ape brain, if properly receiving proper inputs developmentally, you can actually achieve levels that are not as far removed as the human level. And so you could see how evolution had an easier time crossing that gap than you might, at least than we would have assumed before we knew this.
TV sitcoms use canned laughter because the sad truth is that happy sounds are infectious. Now comes research that at least partly explains why. It was published this week in the Journal of Neuroscience. A British research team played various sounds, including laughter, to people who were having their brains scanned by a functional MRI machine. All the sounds activated the premotor cortical region of the brain. That area prepares facial muscles to move. And positive sounds like laughter got a much bigger brain reaction than negative sounds like retching. Blech. The announcement of the study specifically mentioned this clip of commentators at a cricket match losing it for some reason. I can't help laughing when I hear it. I don't even know what they're talking about.
35 minutes, hit a 4 over the wicketkeepers. Beggars, for goodness sake, stop it.
Yes, Lawrence played extremely well.
So the body may be programmed when we hear laughter to at least smile and possibly even chuckle, chortle, or guffaw. Might be because social bonding is so important for us humans.
This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers use to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here. And this is actually the bomb. It's a smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there. Then these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample. When your sample burns or combusts, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how does a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter. And what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stirrer is going to stir the water that's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature, because as the sample is burned, it'll give off heat and the temperature of the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen. And at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank that's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane.
Why do bumblebees pick some flowers over others? Researchers have known for a while that a flower's color can be a signal. Color is shorthand that says to a bee, "Hey, I got some good quality nectar here. Why don't you stop by for a visit?" But new findings show that bees also use color to get clues about a flower's temperature. And according to a study from a British research team published in the journal Nature, some like it hot. Bees use up a lot of energy just staying warm on some days. In fact, they can't even fly if they're too cold. So if one flower is warmer than another, a bee can save some of its fuel by basking on that flower while it's doing its pollinating business. And it turns out that bumblebees consistently do choose warmer flowers over cooler ones, even when the two flowers offered up the same quantity and quality of nectar. Some plants seem to be evolutionarily adapted to be slightly warmer because the warmer ones get visited more by the chilly bees. When it comes to getting pollinated, apparently the heat is on, and that's the buzz.
Thirdly, life from non-living matter. And this illustration often used is the one of the monkeys at the typewriter. Okay, so we have a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and the claim here is basically if you leave chance and time long enough, you will get life. Don't worry about it. Yes, it's strange. Yes, it's wonderful, but leave enough matter, 600 million years on Earth, and you will have life. So the monkey's sitting at the typewriter, and the chances are eventually he produces the complete works of Shakespeare. So what's the problem? So there's no problem. There isn't an issue, right? You just leave him long enough, you'll be fine. And at 1 keystroke a second, the monkey might well eventually get to the complete works of Shakespeare, but he doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So what I decided to do to run the numbers is instead of saying type the complete works of Shakespeare, I just ran the numbers for how long would it take a monkey typing at 1 keystroke a second to type to be or not to be, that is the question, right? On average, how long is it going to take my monkey friend at 1 keystroke a second? I don't know how long you think that would be. Maybe you could have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth is supposed to have emerged within? And when I ran the numbers, to be or not to be, that is the question, takes 12.6 trillion years to type just that phrase. And a DNA string, which you have to have for like the life we have now, doesn't emerge is not like a sentence's worth of information. A DNA string has got as much information as the Encyclopedia Britannica. Right? So if we're saying that emerged, something of that complexity emerged by chance, undirected, within 600 million years, again, it's mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God creating life is simply a question of saying, let there be, and there was.